The sand had been blowing for 3 days when Kara Langdon decided she was done waiting. She sat cross-legged on the floor of the storage bay, back against a crate of excavation equipment, turning the brass medallion over and over in her fingers. Her father had given it to her. The Vorath soldiers arrived, pressed it into her palm without ceremony, the way he handed her coffee or a pencil, as if it were a small thing. It wasn't small. He'd worn it since before she was born. She could feel the warmth his body had left in it, even now, 2 days after they'd taken him through the ring. Outside, the wind pressed against the warehouse walls like something living. The structure was old British colonial construction. Corrugated steel over, timber framing, bolted to a concrete slab somewhere in the Egyptian interior, exactly the kind of place that didn't appear on any map that mattered. Father had chosen it for precisely that reason. 11 years of classified excavation work. 11 years of turning the most impossible object in human history over and over in his hands. The same way she was turning this medallion, looking for the answer to a question that kept changing shape. The ring was called many things. Her father called it the Arch. The academics who didn't know about it called it a legend. The Vorath called it something in their own tongue that Kara had only heard once, from the commander in the instant before he realized she could hear him. And that sound of it had made the back of her neck go cold. She stood up. She was 26 years old. She had 2 degrees she'd finished before most people started one. She had her father's on the stubborn temper and a particular quality that certain people in her life had called recklessness and other people had called courage. And the main difference between those 2 groups was whether they'd been there when it mattered. She went to find Owen. Captain Owen Bray was playing cards with Waleed in the back of the Jeep, which was parked with its bonnet pointed at the warehouse's sliding doors so the engine cable could reach the arch. This had been Kara's idea. She'd watched the Vorath commander do it, standing in the shadows of the upper gantry, while they held her father at gunpoint on the floor below. She'd watched the way he attached the leads to the ring's base contacts, the way he called out sequences of symbols in that flat, carrying voice, the way the inner ring began to rotate. She'd memorized the sequence he used. She'd written it on the inside of her left forearm in black marker before the memory could fade. Owen looked up from his cards when she approached. He was British military, technically off-duty, technically in Egypt on leave, technically not supposed to be anywhere near a classified excavation site. He was there because of Kara, and because he had a quality she'd always valued in people. He was very good at deciding when the rules were the right shape for the situation and when they weren't. "I know what you're going to say," he told her. "Do you? You're going to say it's time." Waleed put his cards face down on the seat between them. He was Egyptian, mid-30s, precise in his movements the way a man becomes precise when he has survived enough situations where imprecision had consequences. He'd worked with her father for 3 years. He knew the warehouse, knew the arch, knew the sequence of events that had unfolded 2 nights ago better than either of them wished he did. Because he'd been standing 20 feet away when the Vorath took Professor Langdon through, and he'd seen what happened to Corporal Hewitt when Hewitt tried to stop them. "The symbols," Waleed said. "You memorized them. Everyone." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved against the wall. Somewhere above them, a piece of loose corrugated steel ticked against its neighbor. "I watched my uncle fail to save someone once," Waleed said finally. "He spent the rest of his life not going through a door he could have gone. I don't recommend it." Owen closed his eyes briefly, the expression of a man making peace with something. Then he got out of the Jeep. "Right," he said. "Tell us what we need." The Vorath soldier they'd left behind, bound now to a steel chair with extension cord, his uniform jacket gone because Kara needed the material, had watched them work without speaking for most of an hour. He was young, she thought, younger than she'd expected. His face was humanoid in most respects. The bilateral symmetry, the forward-facing eyes, the arrangement of features that said, social creature, pack animal, something that had evolved in open country and needed to read the intentions of others at a distance. But his eyes were a deep amber that caught light like metal, and his hands had 7 fingers, and the bony ridge along his jaw was something that no human skull had ever grown. He spoke when they connected the second cable to the base contact. "You will not make it back," he said. His Terran standard was accented but clean. The Vorath had been intercepting human radio transmitters for decades. Their linguists were thorough. "The commander will kill you the moment you emerge." "Then why are you telling me?" Kara asked, not looking up from the connection. A pause. "I don't know," he said, and he sounded genuinely uncertain, which she found more interesting than anything else he might have said. She straightened and looked at him. He looked back at her with those amber eyes. "What's your name?" she asked. "Do not give names to. I'm asking anyway." Another pause. "Rennick," he said. "Rennick." She nodded once. "If we make it back, I'll come untie you. If we don't, someone will eventually find you. This structure appears on no German maps and 2 British ones, so it'll probably be the British." She turned back to the ring. Behind her, Rennick made a sound she couldn't quite classify. It might have been a laugh. The inside of the wormhole was nothing she had words for. She'd expected darkness. She'd expected the compressed time experience of a very fast journey, the way you barely register the passage of a tunnel on a train. What she got instead was the sensation of being briefly everywhere at once. As if the universe had turned itself inside out to show her its workings. All of it. Every star, and cold space, an improbable pocket of warmth where life clung to rock and refused to stop. And then it was over, and she was standing on stone in a vast echoing chamber, and the air tasted of mint minerals and something faintly sweet. 3 moons hung in a pale sky beyond the open arch of a window, and none of them was the moon. Owen was beside her, his hand on the wall, breathing in the short, controlled way of a man who was not going to panic, but was allowing himself a moment to be astonished. Waleed was already looking around, already cataloging, already useful. "There," he said quietly. Down the chamber, past a row of carved basalt pillars, 2 Vorath soldiers stood at either side of a doorway. They hadn't noticed the gate activation. The chamber was large enough that the light from the ring's event horizon had washed over the far end, without being remarkable. The soldiers were facing away. Kara pressed herself flat against the pillar nearest to her, and felt the texture of it under. Palm, dressed stone, ancient, fitted without mortar. And thought someone built this, someone made this place. Some civilization stood here, and looked at this sky, and decided to make something permanent. She found the thought bracing rather than frightening. Permanence implied there was time to figure things out. Owen tapped her elbow. 2 fingers, then a pointing gesture. He'd seen another exit, a passage to the left that the soldiers weren't watching. They moved. The facility on the other side of the passage was not what she'd expected from an alien world, which was, she'd expected less. More raw, somehow. More inhospitable. What she found instead was something that felt genuinely occupied. Worn paths in the sandy floor, objects arranged and rearranged over long use. The material texture of a place that people lived in and maintained and cared about. There were hangings on the walls in geometric patterns. There were vessels of fired clay with geometric markings that matched. She realized with a start the symbols on the arch's inner ring. The Vorath commander was in the central room. He was tall, they all were, a head and a half above Kara's considerable height, and built with the forward lean of a species that had evolved as pursuit predators. He stood with his back to them, facing a table where her father sat. Professor Langdon looked tired but not harmed. He had his hands flat on the table, and he was speaking in a low, careful voice. The way he spoke when he was translating something difficult and didn't want to lose the thread. Kara's chest did something complicated. She pressed back further into the doorway's shadow. The commander was speaking to her father, and her father was speaking back, and between them on the table was an object she didn't recognize. A smooth disk of dark metal, dense enough that the table's surface had slightly bowed under its weight. Even from across the room, she could feel something from it. Not heat, not magnetism, something older than either of those. "What is that?" Owen murmured against her ear. "I don't know," she murmured back. "He wants my father to help him understand it." "Why your father specifically?" She looked at the inscriptions along the disk's edge. Then she looked at the carved markings on the walls. Then she looked at her father's hands, flat on the table, patient, and unhurried in the way they'd always been when he was working on something that mattered. "Because my father has been reading this language for 11 years, she said. They needed a distraction. Owen volunteered. "I'll go in straight," he said, as if this were something he'd considered and found to be the cleanest option, rather than a form of controlled insanity. "Make noise. Draw them out this way. You get your father and go back to the gate. There are at least 4 soldiers in there," Kara said. "Yes, Owen." Kara. He said her name the way he always said it when she was about to explain his own plan back to him. Flat, patient. A little fond. "I know. Go." He went left. She went right. The distraction worked better than it should have. She heard him shout something. She couldn't make out the words. The register was exactly the one most likely to get a soldier's attention. Loud, male, authoritative, wrong somehow. The auditory equivalent of a thing out of place. She heard boots on stone. She came through the main doorway in the gap it created. Father looked up from the table. He said, "Kara." Not a question, not surprise. Just the particular tone of a man who had raised a daughter like her, and had on some level known this moment would come. "We need to go," she said. "The disc. Leave it. Kara, it's..." Now, Dad, he stood. He was slow, whatever they'd given him. Some sedative in his food, perhaps. But his eyes were clear. He put his hand on her arm, and she put her hand over his, and they moved. Behind them, the disc sat on the table, its strange dark weight undiminished, its inscriptions unchanged. She looked back once. She filed it away. They got turned around in the passages. This was her fault, and she knew it. She'd memorized the route from the gate chamber to the main room, in the dark with her father's weight on her arm, and the sounds of Owen somewhere behind them. Doing things she could hear but not see. She took a right where she should have taken a left. And suddenly they were in a corridor she didn't recognize, wider than the others, with a draft coming from somewhere ahead. The draft was warm and spiced with something she couldn't name. "There's an opening ahead," Waleed said. He'd appeared from a side passage like a question mark, resolving itself into a statement. She'd never been so glad to see anyone. "I know another way to the gate," he said. "I explored before I came to find you." "Of course you did," she said. "One of us had to." They followed him. The corridor opened onto the outside, the actual outside, the planet's surface. The alien desert with its pale sky and its 3 moons still hanging there as if they'd been painted. The air hit her like a wall. It was hot and dry and carried that sweet mineral smell she'd noticed immediately upon arrival, more concentrated now, as if the rock itself was breathing it out. There was a settlement below them, low structures in pale stone, following the contour of the dune, smoke rising from several points, figures moving between them. The figures stopped. One of them looked up. His name was something in the local tongue that she couldn't quite reproduce. He told her to call him Cass. He was young, 20, perhaps, and slight in the way of someone who had grown up in a place where the land did not produce abundance. But he moved with the particular confidence of a man who knew exactly which patch of ground he was standing on and what it could do. He looked at the 4 of them with an expression she'd seen before, on the faces of people who had decided, quickly, and on limited information, they were going to help. She'd always trusted that expression. The village took them in with the pragmatic hospitality of people who had very little but had learned that sharing it was more useful than hoarding it. She was given water and food, flat, bread, and something dried, that tasted of nothing she had a reference for, pleasant in its strangeness. And she sat across from her father in the low firelight and watched him eat, and felt the specific exhaustion of an deal that has ended close enough to well. He told her what the disc was. "A power source," he said quietly, "or the precursor to one. Whatever they're mining here." He gestured vaguely toward the rock walls, toward the deep-cut shafts she'd noticed near the settlement's edge. "It has properties I've never encountered. The commander calls it something in his own language. The nearest translation I can manage is something like, the stone that speaks. He wants to bring it home. He wants to bring a great deal of things home." Her father looked at his hands. "He showed me his plans, Kara. He wasn't careful about it, which I think means he never intended me to leave here with the knowledge." A pause. "He intends to use the gate as a supply line. What grows here, what is mined here, he wants all of it. And in exchange he'll offer..." He stopped. "People," her father said. "He'll offer people." She was quiet for a long time. "He had a film projector," her father continued. He showed her, the one who commands this place, the one called Asit. He showed her propaganda footage. Images of armies, of industry, of what he said was human power. He told her we could be useful to each other. Kara thought about Rennick, back in the warehouse, telling her she wouldn't make it back. She thought about the uncertainty in his voice. Did she believe him? I think she wanted to. She's in a fight of her own. Against someone she calls the Queen. Someone far more powerful. Someone she's been in rebellion against for a very long time. He shook his head. She's not wrong that she needs allies. She's wrong about which ones to choose. How do we stop him? That, her father said, I have been thinking about. Cass showed her the cave an hour later. He led her up through the village, through a passage she would not have found on her own, and into a cavern where the walls were covered in symbols. She brought her lamp and held it close, and felt the same sensation she always felt in front of ancient writing. The particular vertigo of encountering meaning preserved across time, the recognition that language is humanity's oldest and strangest technology. The symbols matched the ones on the gate's dialing device. She understood immediately. The address back to Earth, carved here in this cave, by someone who had gone through the gate and come back and known, had known with the specific certainty of someone who had done a thing and wanted to make sure someone else could do it. That it needed to be preserved. She read it twice. She found a sharp stone and scratched it into the leather cover of the notebook in her jacket pocket. Then, very deliberately, she went back to the wall and obscured several of the symbols with the flat of her hand, pressing clay from the cave floor into the carved lines until the sequence was incomplete. Enough left to confirm she'd read it right, not enough for anyone else to dial without guessing. Cass watched her do this without expression. Someone told me to, she said, in case he was wondering. He looked at her for a moment. Your father is very like you, he said, in imperfect but careful Terran standard. Perhaps you are like him. I think it goes both directions, she said. They found Owen in the village at dawn. He was sitting with 2 Voroth soldiers, both of them stripped of weapons and looking irritated about it in the specific way of people who can't believe how the last 4 hours went. And eating bread in the pragmatic way of someone decided that being alive was the priority and everything else could be attended to later. He had a cut above his left eye, and his knuckles were in a state that she decided not to examine closely. He looked up when she arrived. Commander? She asked. Working on it, he said. Owen, he's in the facility, with a set. He took another piece of bread. Something shifted between them, I think. One of his men, the woman, the one with the camera, she did something. I don't know exactly what. Eva, her father said. You know her? We spoke briefly. The professor sat down beside Owen, with the careful movements of someone whose joints were reporting grievances. She was not comfortable with the direction things had taken. Then let's use that, Kara said. The thing about the Voroth, which Kara only understood fully in the moments that followed, was that they had an absolute and articulated understanding of power. They had taxonomies for it. They had rituals. They had social structures built around the precise gradations of who could direct whom and under what circumstances. And those structures had served them well across a very long history of interplanetary expansion, and they had never once in that history encountered a species that simply didn't recognize the hierarchy as real. This was, it turned out, critical vulnerability. She walked into the facility through the main entrance. Not a back door, not a hidden passage. The main entrance, in the early light, with her father on her left, and Owen on her right, and Waleed behind her, and she walked the way she'd learned to walk in excavation sites that didn't want her there, and classified briefing rooms that didn't expect her, and faculty meetings where she was the youngest person, and the only one who'd actually read the primary sources. With the settled certainty of someone who knows what they're there to do. The soldiers at the gate stopped her. She spoke to them the first 3 words of Voroth she'd learned from Rennick in the warehouse, which she'd spent 2 days memorizing from a linguistic analysis document in her father's case files. The words meant something approximately like, by the authority of the process that is currently underway. The construction was imprecise, and her accent was certainly dreadful, but the words were the right words. And they implied that she was the next thing in a sequence that had already been set in motion by someone above. their pay grade, and the soldiers. Because they understood hierarchy, and because a young human woman striding into a Vorath facility through the door was an event too strange to be unauthorized, let her through. The commander was in the central room, so was Aset. She was smaller than Kara had imagined from description, though nothing about her was small in any way that mattered. She was a woman who had fought her way through a very long rebellion against an enemy with overwhelming power, and she wore that history in the way she stood. Not heavy with it, but aware of it. The way a blade is aware of what it's been through in the difference between its edge and a piece of new metal. She looked at Kara with eyes that evaluated quickly and completely. The commander did not look at Kara. He looked at the space around her, the doorway, the passage beyond, trying to understand how this had happened, which was already a mistake because it meant his first response was confusion rather than action. "You came back," he said, in Vorath. Father translated quietly, unnecessary. She'd understood the tone. "I need something from you," she said to Aset. Aset tilted her head. A very small movement. Around her, her soldier. The tall one, Circuit, who moved like a language constructed entirely of threats. Shifted. Fractionally. "You went through the gate," Aset said, in the local tongue that her father translated. "I was told you would not return." "People keep telling me that," Carrot. A very long pause. "What do you need?" Aset asked. What she needed was simple. To say it was complicated in the way that simple things always are, when they involve asking someone to trust you on the basis of 40 acquaintance and a rescue story they have no way to verify. She needed Aset to let them leave. She needed Aset not to help the commander build his supply line. She laid out the argument with the same precision she used for academic papers. Was not a precision of language, exactly, but of sequence. The careful ordering of information such that each piece arrived exactly when the listener needed it to understand the next one, she said. "He showed you an army," she said. "An army is not allies, it is a promise. And a promise is only worth the values of the person making it." And she had seen what the commander valued. She said, "What you need is not a supply line pointed at a species you don't know. What you need is a supply line you control. What you need is something more than a transaction," she said. "We don't know each other. I understand that. But I know this. He will not come back with what he promised. He never intended to." She said this last, looking at the commander. He looked back at her with amber eyes and said nothing. Eva, standing in the corner with her camera at her side, made a quiet sound. The commander turned to her, sharp, a fraction too late. "She's right," Eva said, in German. Then carefully, in the Vorath trade language, "She is right." What happened next took about 30 seconds. It is not useful to recount it in detail. It was chaotic, and it was fast. And in its resolution, Kara found herself standing slightly to the left of where she'd been, with her hand on her father's arm, and Owen somewhere close behind her and the commander, on the floor, in a position that made it clear he would not be getting up quickly. And Aset standing over him with an expression that Kara recognized from the faces of people who have finally done the thing they should have done much sooner. Cirquette had Kara's notebook. She was looking at it. At the scratched sequence on the cover, she looked up. Eyes were the amber of all Vorath eyes, but older, something in them that had seen many things, and was still deciding what to do with what they held it out. Kara took it. "Go," Cirquette said in the local tongue. Cass walked them to the gate. He moved through the village at the hour before, full light, past the morning fires, and the people tending them, past the children who should have been asleep and weren't, past all the small evidence of a civilization, getting through its days with the tools available to it. The village was old. The people in it were old in the way that cultures become old when they are continuous, layered, adapted, wearing their history and their habits, the way a river wears the shape of its bed. She thought about what her father had said, the things that were mined here, the stone that speaks. She thought about what it would mean for a place like this if someone opened a supply line through it. She thought about the cave and the symbols she'd obscured. At the gate, Cass stopped. He looked at her in the way he'd looked at her when she'd obscured the symbols. Not judgment, exactly. Assessment. "You will come back," he said. "Not a question." "Not me," she said, "not me, specifically, but someone will." He considered this. Bring someone who reads the language better, he said. I'll see what I can do. He took her hand between both of his, a gesture she didn't know the meaning of but felt the weight of, and then stepped back, and she turned to the gate. Waleed had already identified the correct symbol sequence on the dialing device. He'd done this quietly while she was talking to Cass, the way he did most things, without announcement. He pressed the first symbol, and it lit with a sound like a muffled bell. Going first, Owen asked. I'll go, her father said. Dad, I'll go first. He looked at her. I came through the other direction, and I know what to expect. And if anything goes wrong on the other side, I need to be there first. She looked at him. She thought about the specific selflessness of parents, which is different from ordinary selflessness. It's not the selflessness of a person choosing something. It's the selflessness of a person for whom the choice has become structural, built into who they are. Fine, she said. He squeezed her shoulder and turned to the gate. Waleed pressed the remaining symbols. The ring spun. The event horizon exploded outward in that wave of displaced energy, and then settled, vertical and glowing and improbable, the way it always looked in her mind's eye when she thought about impossible things that were nevertheless real. Her father walked through, then Owen, then Waleed. She stood alone in front of the gate for a moment. She looked back at the village, at the smoke, rising against the pre-dawn sky, three hanging there in their patient improbability. She thought, someone built this place. Someone stood here and looked at this sky and made something that mattered. She put her hand in her jacket pocket and touched the leather cover of the notebook. The scratched sequence of symbols, the address. She went through. The warehouse was cold after Abydos. The Egyptian night came in under the doors in long, flat drafts. And the fluorescent lights overhead were still running, doing what they'd done every night for 11 years while she and her father sat over. Photographs and measurements and a series of notebooks that would eventually fill 12 archive boxes in a storage facility in Edinburgh. Father was standing in the middle of the floor, looking at the arch. He did this sometimes, just stood there looking at it. She'd grown up watching him do it. It had always looked to her like the way religious people stood in front of sacred objects. Not quite prayer, not quite something between. She stood beside him. Rennick was still in his chair. He was awake, watching them with his amber eyes, his Vorith-patient stillness. He'd been in that chair for approximately 5 hours, and he looked, to her assessment, less than fully comfortable. She went to him and unknotted the extension cord. He stretched his hands, 7 fingers spreading slowly, the joints clicking. You came back, he said. I said I would. A pause. The commander, he said. He's alive, she said. He's on Abydos. What happens there is between him and the being in charge of the place, and I didn't ask for specifics. Rennick stood. He was taller than she'd fully registered from across the room. They all were. But standing here, in this human space, he seemed less like a soldier, and more like something navigating an environment it hadn't expected to find interesting. He looked at the arch. My people have been using this technology for 900 years, he said. Ours have been looking at it for 11, she said. He seemed to think about that. And in 11 years, a girl with a notebook decided to go through it and come back with her father and obstruct a military supply operation. Woman with a notebook, she said. I have a doctorate. His jaw did something. She was increasingly certain it was a laugh. What happens to you now, she asked. I will file a report. There will be a review. He glanced at her. I will tell them the operation was compromised by unforeseen factors, human factors. She felt the weight of that. Will they come back? Eventually, he said. There are protocols for situations like this. There are people I can contact who are more interested in contact than in extraction. He said this with a careful blankness that told her it was meaningful in ways she didn't yet have the context to understand. Won't be quick. How long? He considered. Long enough for a woman with a notebook to prepare. She looked at the arch. She thought about the cave on Abydos, the symbols she'd obscured. The symbols still intact enough to confirm she'd read them right. The sequence in her notebook, scratched into leather in the lamplight. She thought about what a supply line through a gate would mean, and what a different kind of line, a line built on different values, different intentions, might mean instead. She thought about Cass saying, Someone who reads the language better. I'll need funding, she said. You'll need more than that, her father said. He'd been listening. He always was. She looked at him, really looked at him. The way you look at someone you've been scared of losing, and saw that he was tired and a little battered and more alive in his eyes than she'd seen him in 2 years. Start with funding, he said. The rest follows. He put his arm around her shoulders, briefly, the way he'd done since she was small. You'll figure it out. You always do. She sent Rennick off into the Egyptian night with a canteen and the address for a safe house she was reasonably sure was clean, and stood in the warehouse doorway watching his shape diminish against the dark until she couldn't see him anymore. Owen came to stand beside her. You know they'll come back, he said. Yes. And will, he stopped. What do we do? She turned the medallion over in her fingers. She thought about the arch, and the address on the dialing device, and the cave on Abydos with its preserved sequence, and the notebook in her pocket, and the specific weight of things that get handed down. Not through inheritance but through intention, through the decision to keep something going, even when the funding runs out and the answers don't come. And the desert blows for 3 days, and you sitting on a floor in a warehouse, turning a medallion over and over in your fingers, deciding whether to move. We get ready, she said. Owen was quiet for a moment. The wind had died. The stars over the Egyptian interior were very clear. She could see the patterns in them that people of this region had been naming for 6,000 years. The same patterns that appeared on the inner ring of the arch, the map written in light that connected this ground to a world with 3 moons and a sky that tasted of minerals. You scratch those symbols on your notebook cover, Owen said. Yes, so they're not lost. They're not lost. He looked at the sky. Then it's not over. She followed his gaze upward. It's not over, she agreed. She tucked the medallion into her pocket next to the notebook. Father's warmth had long since left it, but it had taken on her own in the hours of carrying it, the specific heat of a person who has decided what they're going to do next. She went back inside. She had work to do. 3 weeks after the night she walked back through the arch, Kara Langdon sat in a borrowed office at the University of Cairo and wrote 7 letters. The first to a structural engineer in Aberdeen who had published, in an obscure academic journal, a paper on the load-bearing properties of ancient Egyptian stonework that contained, buried in the appendix, a series of calculations that could only have been done by someone who had access to measurements she couldn't explain. She wrote, I have seen what you've been trying to describe. I'd like to talk. The second was to a former signals officer she'd met twice at her father's conferences. A woman who had spent the last 4 years consulting on radio wave propagation in the ionosphere and had a reputation for asking the wrong questions in the right rooms. She wrote, I need someone who understands frequency, not for what we've been using it for. The third was to Waleed's cousin, who worked for a logistics company with depots in 3 countries, because supply lines, she had learned this on Abydos, watching a Vorath commander try to build one, were not primarily a military question. They were a human question. They were about what you could move, where, when, and who you trusted to move it. The 4th, 5th, 6th were shorter, more careful. She did not say everything in them. She said enough. The 7th she wrote last and set aside without sending. It was addressed to a post office box in Zurich that Rennick had described, before leaving the warehouse, as a place where a message would reach the kind of Vorath who were looking for something different than what their commanders were looking for. She didn't know yet what to say in it. She knew she would. Eventually, she set it in the desk drawer under the other papers and left it there, waiting. Her father came in at noon with tea. He set 1 cup in front of her and kept one for himself and sat in the chair across the desk. It was too small for the amount of material they'd been accumulating and would need to be replaced with a table. The funding meeting, he said. Tomorrow afternoon, you've prepared? I've been preparing for 11 years, she said. I just didn't know what for. He smiled at that. It was a specific smile, the one he kept for moments when the world surprised him by being stranger and more generous than expected. The one she'd grown up seeing, and had spent years trying to understand, and had eventually concluded, was simply the expression of a person who had never quite stopped being astonished by the fact that things kept happening, she thought. I'm going to need to learn Vorath, she thought. I'm going to need someone who reads the ancient language better than either of us, she thought. Kaz said to come back. He didn't say who. She opened the desk drawer and took out the 7th letter and read what she'd written so far, which was not much, only a greeting and a question, and added 3 more sentences. They said, "We are not what your commanders think we are. We are not what you think we are either. We are still deciding what we are." Which I'm told is one of the things that makes us difficult to predict. She sealed the envelope. She put it in the pile with the others. She picked up her tea and turned to the window, which looked out over the university courtyard, where students moved in the warm midday light, backpacks and books, and the ordinary apparatus of people trying to understand things. She watched them for a while. A young man dropped a stack of papers, and another young woman stopped to help him gather them, and they stood there in the courtyard talking for a few minutes before they both moved on, each in their own direction. She thought 900 years. She thought 11 years. She thought long enough to prepare. The arch was in a warehouse outside the city, connected by extension cable to a truck engine, covered by a tarpaulin her father had sourced from a military surplus depot. It was guarded in shifting rotations by Owen and Waleed, and 3 people whose discretion she trusted, and 2 more whose discretion she was cultivating. It was not well hidden. Nothing that large ever is. But it was not drawing attention, which was its own form of concealment. The symbols in her notebook, scratched leather, 7 constellations, the address of another world, were not the only address out there. She knew this, with the certainty of someone who has thought carefully about the geometry of a system. If the arch could reach Abydos, and if the Vorath had been using such technology for 900 years, then the number of places reachable from that address, and from those addresses, and from those, was not a small number. She was one woman with a notebook and a borrowed office and 7 unsent letters. She had been, until 3 weeks ago also, the woman who had never gone through the arch. She filed that fact carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things that were important to remember when the work got difficult. It would. It would get very difficult. She had no illusions about that. She had a great many illusions about a great many things. Everyone does. But not about difficulty. She had learned very early was not something that went away when you acknowledged it. It simply became easier to carry. She looked at the courtyard. The papers were all gathered. The students were gone. She turned back to her desk. She had 7 letters to send and a funding proposal to finish, and a list of 13 teen materials and skills she needed to acquire before she was willing to open the gate again. She picked up her pen. She got to work. The proposal was called, on the cover page, a preliminary framework for the study of anomalous archaeological relics with potential engineering applications, which was a title designed to be read by funding committees without being understood by them, which was an art form her father had spent 3 decades mastering, and she had compressed into about 18 months of watching him do it. The substance of the proposal was different. The substance of the proposal said, there is a door. The door leads somewhere. The somewhere is not empty, not uncomplicated, and not waiting patiently for human beings to decide when they're ready. What is on the other side has been operating according to its own schedule and its own logic for the better part of a millennium. The question of whether human beings will be involved in what happens next is not open. They will be. The only open question is on whose terms. Terms available, as best she could tell, were these. The first was the Vorath model. Extraction, hierarchy, the gate as a supply line, and the species on either side of it as resources in a ledger. This model had been operating for 900 years. It was efficient, and it was terrible, and it had the advantage of clarity. The second was the alternative, which had no name yet, because she hadn't finished building it, but which started with the cave on Abydos and the principles preserved there by someone who had cared enough to preserve them, and with Cass saying, bring someone who reads the language better, and with Rennick sitting in an uncomfortable chair for 5 hours and telling her she wouldn't make it back, and then, when she did, providing the address of a post office box in Zurich. The alternative was built on the stubbornness of small human gestures, on a woman who hit a soldier over the head with a lamp and took notes for 11 years. On an Egyptian man who explored the temple first and reported back without announcing it. On a military captain who walked into a room of armed soldiers and made noise so someone else could get their father out. On a camera operator who had spent weeks watching and finally said, "She's right." She could not put any of this in the funding proposal. She put in, instead, project practical benefits that she was reasonably confident were achievable given resources and time. She put in a risk assessment that accurately described perhaps 40% of the actual risk and structured that 40% in a way that made it legible to people who evaluated risk for a living. And she put in a budget that she had constructed with Waleed over 2 afternoons, and which, probably short by a factor of 3, but which would at least get them started. She signed her name to the bottom of the last page. She thought about the 7 letters in the pile. She thought, start with funding, the rest follows. She took the stack, put on her jacket, picked up her bag, and left the office. The courtyard was empty now. The Cairo afternoon had the specific warmth of a city that has absorbed a full day of sunlight and is slowly releasing it. A warmth that felt banked rather than immediate, something saved up. She crossed the courtyard and went through the gate. The old iron university gate, the ordinary kind, the kind that swings on hinges and is operated by hand, and out into the street. 11 years from now, or perhaps 12, perhaps only 8, if things moved faster than expected, someone would dial a sequence of symbols into a circular device in a warehouse outside Cairo and open a window in space to a planet with 3 moons and pale sky that smelled of minerals. And the people who went through would have better equipment and better preparation, and a great deal more information about what waited on the other side. But the first person through that night 3 weeks ago had been a young woman with a notebook, and nothing she was willing to lose except her father. She hadn't lost him. She walked through the street with the notebook in her jacket pocket, and the brass medallion warm against her palm and the folded funding proposal under her arm, and she thought, this is how it starts. Not with the impossible thing. With the letter and the meeting, the next thing after that, and the next, and the next.